Okay, everybody, I think we are ready to launch SoulCon 2020. Yay. It's Thursday morning here in Columbus, Ohio, a little after 9 a.m. And what can I say? This has been in the making, well, since SoulCon 2019. And with a little bit of sort of throwing some curveballs here and there, here we are for the first day, graduate symposium, where we're going to bring all sorts of amazing scholars from all over the place together to talk about BIPOC comics creators and creations. Anyway, this is like really insanely amazing that we have created this space for Black, Brown, Indigenous, POC creators, comic scholars to come together to really celebrate and affirm what is going on at the forefront, the avant-garde of comics creation and knowledge making. SoulCon 2020, you know, I had a conversation with a reporter the other day, and they asked me, well, so what are some of the big names for SoulCon? And I said, you know, they're all big names. We don't do that kind of thing for SoulCon. There's no hierarchy because everybody's work is as valued as the next person. And this was really important to me because it also resonated with other aspects, visions, practices that we've been putting into play with SoulCon ever since the first year, 5 years ago. This is our 5-year anniversary, which is access and a real sense of a kind of democratizing of the space where everybody is treated equally, where there's no cover to come into the space and to learn and to meet comics creators for our K through 12 kids, for everybody. In fact, that there's no charge for tabling if you're a creator, and that in fact, we even try to help as much as we can with all of our participants make it into this space, the SoulCon space. So yeah, all of this stuff, this question that the reporter had for me brought up all these really important access things that we've been providing, because when you go to the bigger cons like Comic-Con, of course, there's a big overhead, and there's even kind of like you have to be on a list to get your ID tags and all of that. And they seem to have lost that spirit of comics as a kind of great equalizer, as a place to bring communities and folks that have otherwise been pushed to margins into centers. Yeah, that was, you know, this other question that the reporter asked was, you know, how does this fit in with other cons? And it is important that we see ourselves along with our brothers and sisters creating these spaces. MeccaCon, BCAF, the Brown Black Comics Arts Festival in San Francisco, the Latinx Comics Art Festival in Modesto, Latino Comics Expo, the Dallas Latino Comic-Con, all of these, the Indigenous Con, all of these as important spaces for us to come together to celebrate within those regional places, but also always reaching out beyond and helping one another lift the boat, the ship together. Today, we're going to be focused on scholarship. And so with that, I wanted to ask, well, Katlin, in fact, the kind of the genius and the heavy lifter for SoulCon 2020, really pulling this whole thing off. Why comics, and why in particular, why comics of color, just to kind of get us into the groove of thinking about this in a scholarly way?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for getting up early with us. I am super excited about SoulCon 2020, and kind of building off of what Profe has just said. I think that what I'm super excited about in terms of our symposium is that we're bringing together and kind of collapsing those disciplinary boundaries that we oftentimes see in academia, or even when we think about this event itself, right? We're thinking about how are we embracing a kind of public-facing scholarship where folks from wherever can attend this event. They don't have to be affiliated with a university or OSU for that matter. And I think it really speaks to kind of the vision for 2020, which is to sort of like allow for us to be able to engage from various points of entry with the just kind of enormity of pop culture and comic scholarship, but even like thinking beyond that, embodied practices of survival and kind of self-production and just media making. I think that's really important for those of us who are interested in interdisciplinary work. But then even beyond that, I know that we're going to have some students joining us as attendees who maybe have never engaged with pop culture in the classroom. And so my hope is that this is a really cool opportunity to begin doing that kind of practice and seeing how the things that we love in our daily lives actually also shape the work that we can do in the classroom, or even just kind of in our interactions with each other. And before we dive into our first panel, I want to make space to acknowledge some thanks for folks, Yarmir Stoll and Craig Campbell, who've been really instrumental in helping us to get these panels underway, especially for Friday's events. Alex Fresh and Melody Reed at Glass Axis, who have been our co-sponsors for many of the programs that we put together for y'all. Miles Reyes, who's done a lot of our graphics work for these last few days. Yolanda Zepeda and ODI for all of their just like generous support for us in general. And of course, we have to shout out Caitlin McGurk, who is the tech genius behind today, without whom this would honestly be a lot harder and possibly impossible to pull off. And a big shout out to the Billy Ireland for also being one of our co-sponsors as well. But especially I want to draw attention to the fact that this year is our 5-year anniversary, as Profe said, but we're also bringing in a name change, that we're moving from SoulCon, the Brown and Black Comics Expo, to SoulCon, the Brown, Black, and Indigenous Comics Expo. And part of that process was to kind of acknowledge the ways that when we think about what this year of 2020 has brought to us, but also what it's built upon, right? We want to recognize like how settler colonialism and anti-Blackness and state violence and capitalism continually enact harm on Black and Indigenous folks in particular, right? But also we want to think specifically about cross-communal solidarity and what that looks like in real time, but also how we sustain the momentum in a lot of ways in terms of kind of what has come to the forefront in 2020. And I think it's important that we also acknowledge, of course, that SoulCon is coming to you through Ohio State, and of course in Central Ohio. We reside on Shawnee, Miami, and Wyandotte land, and it's crucial to emphasize how the continued occupation of these lands is an act of settler colonial violence. And until these lands and resources are returned to the Shawnee, Miami, and Wyandotte, there is no end or reconciliation to the ongoing physical and cultural genocide committed by what is now referred to as the US. And so it's important to us as SoulCon, but I also call upon our sort of fellow siblings across comics and pop culture scholarship and organizing and activism to be mindful in centering the voices and work of Black folks, of Indigenous folks, of Arab, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, disabled, and queer activists and creators and scholars, because that's really what this moment is calling upon us to do, even more so than before. And my hope is that SoulCon kind of provides a kind of example of how we can do that kind of work of uplifting and amplifying and elevating the voices of each other, especially in a time when we're facing major crises like environmental justice. And I want to also, before we move into our first panel, acknowledge that many of our creators are coming to us from the Bay, which, as many of us know, of course, the US West Coast is enduring some really significant wildfires. And so we send our support and collective just kind of uplifting to our siblings out on the US West Coast as well. But thank you for being with us. We're seriously excited to see you. It's going to be an amazing 3 days of programming. And with that, I will pass the mic to Arielle Irizarry, who is our moderator for the first panel.
Hi, thanks everyone for joining us for panel A, Graphic Borders of the Self and the State. My name is Arielle Irizarry. I'm a PhD candidate in English at The Ohio State University, and I'm glad to be your moderator today. With us today, we have Natalia Colón Alvarez, Preeti Singh, Gabriel Guzmán Camacho, and Melissa Guadrón. If you have questions for our panelists throughout the program, please enter them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can enter questions at any time, and we will try to get to as many as possible at the end of the panel. For general commentary and reactions throughout the panel, please use the chat function. As a reminder, we will ask that all participants keep their microphones muted and their cameras off when they are not presenting. First up, we have Natalia Colón Alvarez. Natalia, please go ahead and turn your camera and mic on and share your screen if you would like to. Natalia is a PhD candidate in popular culture, specifically working in comic studies. Her research centers on looking at the construction of identities and graphic narratives, the material nature of the medium, the participatory culture forged by comics and pop culture fans, and depictions of other bodies and identities. Her paper is titled Cartographies of the Self, the Use of Maps and Mapping Practices in Graphic Memoirs. Take it away, Natalia.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Arielle, for the introduction. This morning, I'm going to be talking you through a modified version of this paper. This project started because I was kept encountering maps and graphic memoirs, literal physical maps that prompted questions about how an author can represent the spatial boundaries of their life. And I started to wonder how these maps fit in visually and narratively into these life stories, especially those concerned with the women authors' relationships to their fathers. These 3 graphic memoirs make an especially productive lens through which to study the use of maps in graphic memoir, as all focus on the process of trying to understand fathers through the deployment of geographical representations of both their own and their fathers' lives. Maps, of course, are productive objects with which to think about borders and boundaries, both geographic and imagined. In graphic memoirs such as Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, T. Bui's The Best We Could Do, Carol Tyler's A Soldier's Heart, and others, the authors portray childhood subjectivity, war experiences, inherited trauma, family relationships, and immigration narratives using maps and placement practices. My aim is to look at how maps are integrated into these graphic memoirs as narrative tools for crafting significant spaces within the author's life stories and depicting spatial relationships within and beyond themselves. I must warn you that talking in detail about various graphic memoirs within my time limit will be tricky, so I've tried to simplify my argument and my examples as much as possible. I'm using Amy Propin's description of the material rhetoric of maps and how, as selective representations of the world, they are always in flux and respond to their shifting contexts and relations. Contemporary cartographic practice, Propin tells us, acknowledges that mapping, while historically understood as an objective scientific practice, is also a cultural practice that may impact how the space is perceived and what action takes place within it. In other words, mapping may also represent an exercise in power. In the case of the text I am examining here, the action that takes place is the author's represented life, which impacts the way that they decide to represent the spaces important to their own and their respective fathers' stories. So by including these partial views of geographical space in their work, authors of graphic memoir complicate our traditional understanding of maps as purely objective. Additionally, the act of drawing the map and the work of self-placement as an imperative for mapping of memoir and memory is an act of power by these women authors in the telling of their stories. This mapping of memory, or spatially affirming a memory, is imperative in our conception of memory and self, according to Gaston Bachelard. He says that memories are motionless, and the more securely they are fixed in space, the sounder they are. For a knowledge of intimacy, localization in the spaces of our intimacy is more urgent than determination of dates. This knowledge of intimacy is one of the primary objectives of the inclusion of maps in Bechdel's, Bui's, and Tyler's graphic memoirs. These women depict their childhoods with often cold, unknowable fathers, and the spatial reconstruction of their relationship points to a drive for that intimacy that Bachelard suggests. To add to this, the material form and visual language of comics already necessitates cartographic readings and understandings. Since maps are graphic depictions of how spaces are brought into relation with one another, they mesh well with the comic's material language. Mapping practices are necessarily enacted by both the author and the reader of graphic text because of the comic's form. Comics are both a cartographic text and a cartographic experience, which includes the visual and material map, as well as the cognitive mapping of narrative. The author builds their narrative spatially, like a map, and the reader navigates it. I lean on Giada Peterle's geocritical and cartographical approach to analyzing comics, in which she argues that comics seem able to activate a geographical and mapping experience, suggesting that comics and mapping practices are linked materially. While I agree with Paterle's interpretation of the cartographic possibilities inherent in the visual and textile form of comics, here I'd like to interrogate how graphic memoirs incorporate literal maps into their visual narratives and how maps function within them. I will start with Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, a family tragicomic, which follows Alison as she tries to understand and come to terms with her late father's life, closeted homosexuality, and sudden death, and how his story inevitably intertwined with and impacted her own. Throughout the memoir, Bechdel emphasizes the importance of the domestic interior spaces she shared with her father, notably their sprawling Gothic Revival maze-like house and the family-owned funeral home. Bechdel meticulously illustrates these intimate spaces and how they both shaped and reflected her view of her father. Part of her focus on their shared lived spaces comes from her inclusion of several maps of Beach Creek, her hometown, suggesting that her father's possible suicide could have stemmed from a sort of small town asphyxiation. In the page on the left of my slide, Bechdel writes, "On a map of my hometown, a circle 1.5 miles in diameter circumscribes A, Dad's grave, B, the spot on Route 150 where he died, near an old farmhouse he was restoring, C, the house where he and my mother raised our family, and D, the farm where he was born." Here she effectively traces Bruce's life retroactively from death to birth, emphasizing the circular nature of spatial relationships and memory work. The panel next to the text box shows the circumference she has laid out, with mapped roads and geographical markers. She writes, "This narrow compass suggests a provincialism on my father's part that is both misleading and accurate." She reinforces this circular spatial view of her father's life elsewhere in the book, which I've also included in the slide. Bechdel's continual use of cartocentered language throughout the book, phrases like geographical relocation, gravitational tug, provincialism, peculiar topography, the narrow compass of her father's lives, could be read as placing an importance in mapping for the retracing of memory. Whether willingly or not, she attempts to understand her father and thus gaining what Bachelard called knowledge of intimacy by placing him in space. Bechdel's maps are both detailed and personalized, like the one containing relatives' houses, and ambiguous and impersonal, like the ensuing road maps and topographical maps. She seems to oscillate between the map as an objective representation of a physical space and the map as a highly personal view of lived experiences, again, tracing her connection to her father through the spaces they shared. Physical and geographical markers are a way to express her self-placement process throughout the memoir, paying attention to detailed topography as a narrative way to traverse her own life story. The only fictional map in Fun Home is little Allison's favorite page in her Wind of the Willows coloring book, its map of the story world. Bechdel traces parallels that connect her childhood fictional space with her childhood physical one, Beach Creek. Bechdel only realizes these spatial connections through the graphic work of maps. After pointing out the parallels, Bechdel gives us the most accurate description of how maps can be used as narrative tools, and I quote, "But the best thing about the Wind of the Willows map was its mystical bridging of the symbolic and the real, and of the label and the thing itself. It was a chart, but also a vivid, almost animated picture." This observation holds up within her own eventual graphic memoirs and might point to why the inclusion of maps in these autobiographical texts is so productive. To graphically chart one's life, or another's, is to bridge the impersonal physical world and one's inner interior spaces. Bechdel's use of maps in Fun Home functions both to approximate a feeling of intimacy with her father and as an exercise in self-placement. She attempts to understand her relationship to her father through her relationship to space. T. Bui's The Best We Could Do also attempts to understand parents through spatial relationships, as Bui tries to understand, quote, the forces that caused her family to flee one country and start over in another. The book follows her parents' upbringing in Vietnam, their lives there and their experiences of the war, and their eventual immigration to the United States. Since a key element in this narrative is the family's geographic relocation, the reader might expect the inclusion of maps in Bui's work. But this first illustration sets up the ensuing maps not as geographically significant, but as almost spiritually embedded into the narrative. In this illustration in this slide, Bui is simultaneously physically marked by her parents' heritage, yet also grasping for that watercolor figure intangibly and emotionally surrounding her and her family's existence. This phantom map of Vietnam feels like it continues throughout the book's watercolor landscapes and shading. Bui's maps are always tonalized through her parents' stories and understanding of their homeland. Her father's stories many times had to do with the topography of his inhabited landscape. He associates the landscapes of his early youth with terror and disappointment, further muddying the already murky picture Bui has of her homeland. The first map on the left in this slide is included when Bui's father is recounting an anecdote, quote, without shape, about a pond in Haiphong in 1951. In the map, the northern mass of inland China is colored in faded black brushstrokes. Laos and Thailand to the east and southeast are tinged red. But Vietnam and the South China Sea are both colored very similarly, a faint wash of reddish color, a thin black line demarcating the end of land and beginning of water. This artistic choice reinforces the watery, boundaryless shape of Vietnam that Bui inherited from her father. While Bui's father has a more complicated and borderless relationship to the land, illustrating his complicated and poor upbringing, Bui's mother has a very concrete and vivid understanding of the spaces she inhabited since her family came from wealth and privilege. This second map in this slide, illustrating Bui's mother's childhood in 1950, is less transparent than the first one, using more solid colors and demarcated borders that suggest Bui's mother's firm rootedness in her national identity away from the fighting of the time. And so Bui's own map of her homeland will always then depend on the way her parents colored Vietnam, how they tonalized these spaces through their memory. The maps in Bui's work then incorporate identity-building concepts of nationhood, nationality, and ethnicity that are worth exploring further. Notions of nationhood and trauma, especially from an American perspective, appear through the map used in Carol Tyler's graphic memoir, Soldier's Heart. In this memoir, Tyler recounts the process of searching for and learning about her father's life during World War II as she herself navigates her own relationships as a daughter, mother, and wife. Tyler makes it her project to excavate and understand the hidden scars of her father and his generation and the way trauma is repressed and can come to the surface unpredictably throughout one's life. Mapping her father's life as a soldier became a duty, even a compulsion for Carol throughout the book. Realizing her feelings of resentment and abandonment from her father throughout her life, similar feelings that we'd seen in Bechdel and Bui, Tyler finally concludes that, quote, as the child of a combat soldier, it is my duty to map this out clearly in detail. The duty Tyler feels to accurately represent her father's life is evident in her map use. Out of the memoirs discussed here, Soldier's Heart includes the most maps by far. Carol's project is to create a scrapbook that maps her father's journey through an experience of the war, beginning in the United States, through Europe, then back home. This map on the right is the first one she uses to start her father's story, which reiterates how she approaches her father's story first through spatial means. His army story begins with his move through this map, not with his draft or his enlistment. Carol intuits that her father's stay in Italy is the source of most of his trauma. In the map that marks the beginning of the Italy chapter, we see her preoccupation with pinpointing her father's trauma to a specific location. This map, while it has the same checkered border and black brackets, fixing it onto the scrapbook page as the ones before it, it features more detail. On the bottom left-hand corner, the northern part of Tunisia is shown with an arrow pointing to her father's journey from North Africa to Sicily to mainland Italy, and finally off the map and into France. The map shows as well an illustration of the Alps and the demarcations of Switzerland, Austria, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. In the upper right-hand corner, Deutschland 44 is written with a red swastika underneath. The edges of the map extending from Deutschland are red and orange, menacingly encircling the white Alps and the yellow-green of Italy. Tyler understands her father and his trauma through a placement of his body in space and time. Tyler clarifies that this Italy scrapbook chapter differs from the two that came before it because now she's looking for evidence of her father's alleged combat injury, but also about the source of his unspoken trauma. In an arresting full-page illustration, the Sentinel marches from the left of the page in the white, wintry Virginia landscape of a World War I memorial.
One left.
1 minute. Okay. So from this slide, I just wanted you guys to see sort of Tyler's consideration of violence in geographical space. And so while these three authors use maps in distinct ways, the maps themselves often work very similarly to signify the author's desired knowledge for intimacy, a triangulation of the relationship with their fathers, and an exercise in placing the self within these spaces. The spaces become significant firstly because the authors place themselves and us as readers within them. I want to show that maps and memoirs can function as exercises in self-placement and a narrative tool to create a knowledge of intimacy about oneself, and in these instances, the subject and body of the father. This discussion on the use of maps within Bechdel's, Bui's, and Tyler's memoirs as narrative tools for crafting significant spaces within their life stories and depicting spatial relationships to their parents leads us to consider the inclusion of maps and cartographic practices within other works of both fiction and nonfiction graphic narratives. In other comic works, maps may be used similarly and even offer more insights into the construction of story worlds, national and personal stories, border spaces, and place-based identities. Thank you. Arielle, you're muted.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Natalia, for your presentation and for turning your camera and mic off. Preeti, you can please turn your camera and mic on now and share your screen if you would like to. Preeti Singh is a fifth-year doctoral candidate in English at The Ohio State University. Her research centers on the relationship between state and culture, post-colonial studies, human rights, the cultural Cold War, South Asian literature and cinema, and global Englishes. Her PhD dissertation, titled Postcolonial Exceptions, Cultural Lives of the Indian National Emergency, 1975 to 1977, explores the representations of the emergency in a range of transnational cultural narratives from the 1960s to the present. She is the president of the South Asian Graduate Studies Association at Ohio State and a founding member of the Voices of the Anthropocene Group. Preeti's research has appeared or is forthcoming in Postcolonial Studies, South Asian Review, the International Journal of Comic Arts, the Journal of Drama Studies, Strange Horizons, and Riot Magazine. Her paper is titled Infrastructural Emergencies in Indian Graphic Narratives. Go ahead and take it away, Preeti.
I'll be talking about this particular graphic novel that represents the Indian national emergency. This is part of my PhD dissertation. A quick word on the emergency. So emergency is a period from 1975 to 77, 21 months, declared by President Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed upon the advice of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. It bestowed upon Gandhi the power to rule by decree, suspending constitutional rights and civil liberties. Delhi Calm, the graphic narrative that I'll be talking about, represents the emergency and charts the lives of a few anonymous, mostly, except the narrator, citizens in 1970s India. The two ideas that I want to take up in my presentation today are first, how the discourse of authoritarian authoritarianism in the emergency was an infrastructural discourse. Among the many cited projects of the emergency, one of them was the slum demolition project undertaken in Delhi in the name of urban beautification. The program for the so-called beautification of Delhi led to large-scale demolitions of slums, houses, and shops in different parts of the city and the nearby villages, causing displacement of more than 70,000 people in the region. And the second thing that I want to talk about is, of course, talk about the relationship between comics and urban modernity. So I'll look at how Delhi Calm taps into the graphic narrative's potential for the representation of urban modernity by portraying how Delhi and discourses of modernity were at the center of authoritarian practices during the emergency. So at the center of Ghosh's graphic novels stands Delhi, or what he calls Power Polis. Being here, claims the narrator, is a necessity, not a compromise. Connections, clubs, circles, circuits, opportunities make the city a fertile subject for the exercise of power. And yet the narrator notes at the beginning that his Delhi is not the Delhi of white ambassadors, leather briefcases, English-speaking convent schools, and stable salaries. Instead, it is a city of pot-bellied enterprises and petty cash fueled by insecurity. These oppositions between class and language resonate throughout the narrative, with accessibility to the city informing the characters' varying access to power. Now, David Harvey writes how the very process of urbanization is a class phenomena, where the surplus has been extracted from somewhere and from somebody, while control over the use of surplus typically lies in the hands of the few. In this context of unequal power and accessibility, the right to the city lies in the citizen's ability to claim some kind of mapping power, to claim some kind of shaping power over the process of urbanization. I want to argue in the paper how Delhi Calm is preoccupied with ways in which the ordinary citizen charts the official territory of the city, where his knowledge of shortcuts makes it possible for the narrator to negotiate with structures of surveillance within an authoritative state apparatus. So a little bit about the context of graphic narratives in India. Abhay Sardesai, writing on the contemporary scene of graphic narratives in India, reads them as biographies of the cities that they are set in. Emma Dawson-Verghese, again, locates the origins of Indian graphic narratives within the context of the growth and development of the Indian publishing industry in the post-millennial moment. She writes, how do patterns of power and visuality in the Indian graphic novel intermesh with the India of today? I argue later in the paper that patterns of seeing in the Indian graphic novel can be located directly within urban modernity of Indian cities like Delhi that emerges as a site of disorientation and disorder in the post-liberalization era. Now, why comics and infrastructures of modernity? Why are comics a great form to take out, why are comics a great medium to talk about urban modernity in post-colonial cities like India? First of all, of course, we know about comic theorists who've talked about spatiality as central to meaning making in comics, Scott McCloud. Then you have Aronson Metling, who talks about the abilities of the medium as well as cityscapes to reflect on the conditions of their historical origin in the mass culture of urban modernity, their cultural and medial determinations, their spatial particularities in style, content, and representation. And then Balzer notes how the comics medium and the intermingling of images and words reflects a semiotic shift occurring in the urban living space at the turn of the century, thus making comics a suitable medium for the examination of post-colonial urban modernities. Delhi Calm taps into the graphic narrative's potential for the representation of urban modernity by portraying how Delhi, and most importantly, discourses of modernity, were at the center of authoritarian practices during the emergency. Now, the fascination of Jagmohan, who is an important figure in the emergency, he was the president of the Delhi Developmental Authority, and he was fascinated with the demolition artist and tyrant urban planner Haussmann, who is known for undertaking urban demolitions in France. The rebuilding, and he wanted to rebuild this particular slum, this particular locality called Shahjahanabad in Delhi. And he says that the rebuilding of this locality for him was not just an act of isolated civic reform. It involves the vaster task of restructuring the fundamental forces that govern the lives of people. And it is noteworthy that while the sphere of culture experienced widespread policing during the emergency, policies of government in the cityscape also operated through an aesthetic logic. So Dia Shergardner talks about how city planning as an aesthetic mode of governing by pointing out how aesthetic judgments are central to the delineation of state policy and practice. This cultural logic of beautification in city governance propagated through the discourse of development and planning was central to Indira Gandhi's policies pertaining to Delhi, which is why I feel it's necessary to look at cultural production as integral for thinking about the infrastructural policies of the emergency. Now, I'm thankful that Natalia did such a great theoretical reading of maps in graphic novels. I want to look specifically at two panels or a series of panels from Delhi-Com and talk about them in some detail. Now, Delhi-Com devotes 8 consecutive page-length panels to the slum demolitions carried out in Delhi. The colloquial speech balloons make promises of urban transformation, proclaiming that Delhi will be Paris soon, as the smiling saviors, and these are the people who are enforcing the demolition projects, the agents of the state, are represented as masked figures, and they are called smiling saviors, like this person, this figure here. As the smiling saviors, masked agents of the government announce plans of demolition. You will be delighted to learn that the government and the commissioner have decided to make the city sparkle, to make Delhi better than Paris, notes the savior. They've decided to make the machines of progress into your undesirable homes. These machines work at 2 levels in the consecutive panels. On one hand, the bulldozers descend on the people in a remarkable visual representation of progress imposed from above. And on the other hand, one of the characters stands at the rubble of his home holding a radio, listening to the cricket commentary for a game featuring India and West Indies. While the bulldozer and the radio both stand as icons of modernity, the cricket commentary serves to highlight and counter the nationalist narrative of progress and speed. And cricket, or narratives of cricket and sports, are entwined with Indian nationalism in interesting ways, and I don't have the space to talk about that here. Henry Lefebvre points out how simultaneity, as opposed to repetition, is a defining trait of the urban. The existence of simultaneity in events, perceptions, and elements of a whole applies unmistakably to the form of the comic book as montage. A single panel in the comic book can include a multitude of voices, perspectives, and attitudes existing simultaneously. Eisenstein, in his dialectical approach to film form, defines montage as an idea that arises from the collision of independent short shots, even opposite to one another. This conception of montage, based on Eisenstein's dramatic principle, taps into his dialectical theory of film form, which allows for the simultaneous coexistence and representation of opposing views. Jason Dittmer discusses this relationship between comics and urbanities materialized in the form of montage by noting how comic book visualities hold out the possibility of introducing a new optical unconscious to geography, one that holds opportunities for more plural, flexible narratives to emerge from a single montage. The comic form as urban montage then becomes a fertile ground for the staging of democracy, allowing the representation of politics not only through the depiction of myriad political voices, but also their constructed mediation through a variety of urban media. The demolition panels are representative examples of a visual palimpsest on account of their simultaneous depiction of various media. Government propaganda blaring through loudspeakers, the continuous stream of cricket commentary, and excerpts from print media like the newspaper and legal reports such as the Shah Commission report of 1989 that delved into the horrors and myriad crimes of the emergency. This simultaneous existence of media is accompanied by a juxtaposition of perspectives. The government's narrative of progress, a dialogue on ethics between 2 people disguised as smiling saviors, and the people's own narrative of trauma and shock at the sudden violence. At the center of the last page-length panel stands a woman caught amidst the rubble of her home and the barbed wires crying, "Welcome to the city of Paris," in stark contrast to the government propaganda represented through visual renditions of official documents that deny any coercion or violence in the Delhi beautification program. The state narrative claims that not a single policeman was employed. Official machinery did not involve itself at all in the shifting, and this stands in stark contrast to the violence represented in the images. And the second part of my paper looks at maps and everyday life in the city. While the representation of violence remains central to the demolition panels, Ghosh's narrative portrays the looming threat in the lives of Delhi citizens through its documentation of the everyday life of the city and those who live at its margins. Delhi Calm begins by situating the individual at the center of political conflict. The first panel portrays the protagonist, Vibhuti Prasad, sitting on a chair reading the newspaper with a map of the world under his feet. Prasad goes on to recount his morning rituals. He says, "I'm an early riser. To get up before the city wakes suits me." Both the image and the text that accompanies that photo put the protagonist's subjectivity in conversation with the space of the city. This would be the first in the many instances of the inclusion of maps in the novels. Theoreticians of mapping have repeatedly stressed that the drawing of maps is an exercise in power. Roland Barthes, in his essay Semiology and the Urban, notes how modern cartography is the kind of obliteration of censorship that objectivity has imposed on signification. He goes on to point out that the oldest maps of the world were based on oppositions: hot lands and cold lands, known and unknown lands, and the opposition between men on one hand and monsters and chimeras on the other hand. The mapping of power requires a set of oppositional subjectivities, the necessity of the self and its other that stake their claim to territory. The graphic form tampers consistently with this exercise of power by allowing the comic artists to inscribe themselves in the official narratives represented by the map, thus writing the everyday in state narratives of space. The multimodal form of the graphic narrative allows for the representation of this subjective mapping of the city through the inclusion of maps redrawn by the author narrative. In Delhi Calm, the imposition of pencil sketches highlights the shortcuts that citizens adopt and the insertion of drawings of people who are affected by state-altered geography, which allows for an alternative narrative of space from the point of view of the citizens who occupy them. Now, I have here 2 page-length panels consisting of a stenciled cut-off, a topographical map of Delhi, and another one that represents the Prime Minister's son imagining his project of building a car factory in the space. The first image depicts the army with their guns and telescopes. Both pages portray the military looking down at the peasants, while the latter look up in various poses of defiance, anger, and fear. The map continues on to the next page, where the figures of Jayaprakash Narayan, Sanjay Gandhi, and many other leaders associated with the emergency are inscribed within the frame. A road runs through the map, representing the division between the agents of state-sanctioned violence and those at the receiving end, denoting the fissures that exist between the people, their leaders, and those that mediate structures of power in a democracy. I would argue that the graphic artist's redrawn maps become key instances of simultaneously representing and interrupting the dynamics of power that characterize the period. Moreover, these maps are palimpsests and that insert the citizen's subjectivity within the geographical limits of the nation. The road running through the map traces the passage of a toy car, and this is a continuation of this other the image that I have on the left, and is a complement to this first image that portrays Indira Gandhi's son, Sanjay, or the prince in the novel, playing with his toy car at home. The Shah Commission, established to investigate into the excesses of the emergency, concluded that the demolitions in Delhi were intended to benefit Sanjay Gandhi, his cronies and relations, with no better justification for the operation than that the structures in question caused him to slow down his car as he drove to his Maruti factory or to his mother's farmhouse in Mehroli. Ghosh caricatures his son as the prince, and while he remains absent from the map in the second image, the toy car inscribes the history of Maruti in the violent urban politics of the emergency years. While the state turned legal records into works of fiction, Delhi Calm provides the reader with semi-testimonial accounts of the emergency years. Ghosh portrays the common man in a shifting relationship with centers of power by giving us forms of testimony that make visible the relationship between the state and its subjects. I want to emphasize how the narration of testimony and witness in Delhi Calm is mediated specifically through urban markers. Windows of houses and buses are represented in the form of a comic panel through which the protagonist looks at the unfolding of events in the wake of the emergency. The unique, and this is Hilary Chute notes that the unique spatial grammar of gutter, grids, and panels suggestive of architecture allows for the representation, for the spatial representation of the relationship between the public and private space by inscribing the narrator protagonist within a frame that could be read as symptomatic of the private sphere, while the public sphere remains scattered, uncontained, both in the formal and political sense of the term. In various panels, Delhi citizens are portrayed through...
You've got 1 minute.
Okay. are portrayed through the windows of a bus. So here, I just want to end with this particular image, which has these three segments. The upper segment reads Daftar, which says office, and the lower part carries instructions: keep quiet, maintain distance, and the medium segment of the panel represents the office goers with gags. These panels, symbolic of the censorship that the emergency imposed on people, counter the discourse of the latter as a situation necessitated by popular demand. The precariousness of life during the emergency gets imposed on the urbanscape too. The city, as Vibhuti Prasad, the narrator, puts it, stares at me suspiciously as a new neighbor, not sure whether to smile, but constantly gauging. I'm surrounded by invisible eyes trailing me step by step. So the city emerges in Delhi Calm as a mirror of the citizen subject, reflecting his insecurities, precariousness, and fear. Through this association, it is rendered into a subject in its own right.
All right, thank you so much, Preeti. You can go ahead and turn your camera and mic off now. And Melissa, please go ahead and turn your camera and mic on now and share your screen if you would like to. Melissa earned her master's in English at SUNY Albany. Oh, I'm sorry. I've skipped a lot of information. Melissa Guadrón is a third-year PhD student in the Rhetoric, Composition, and Literacy program at The Ohio State University. Her areas of expertise include disability theory, narrative, and contemporary rhetorical theory. Her current research focuses on the practice of dignified care during the COVID-19 crisis. As president of GAMA, Graduate Association of Mental Health Action and Advocacy, she is overseeing the installation of OSU's first quiet room. Melissa earned her master's in English at SUNY Albany. Her thesis, entitled Attitudes Towards Mental Illness and Mental Health in the Literature Classroom, explored how students self-disclose when encountering narratives focused on mental health and illness. More recently, Melissa has focused her efforts on works that center her status as a queer, disabled Latinx woman and a first-generation American. Her latest publication, Hey, Who Took My Spoons?, explores the daily process of exerting psychic, emotional, and physical labor as a marginalized person. Her upcoming publications include Foul of Form and Barren of Mind, Disability in the Comics of Steve Gerber, and Marcela Zamora and Tatiana Hueso, Rebuilding Salvadoran Civil War Narratives Through Feminist Care Ethics, both co-authored with Denon Ellis. Her paper, Two in One Body, Mestiza Identity in My Favorite Things is Monsters, explores the queer Latinx protagonist of artist Emil Ferriz's Eisner Award-winning graphic novel through the theoretical lens of Gloria Anzaldua's conception of La Frontera. Melissa, please take it away.
Thank you. Okay. Emil Ferriz's My Favorite Thing is Monsters takes place in civil rights era Chicago. It tells the story of a young girl and artist, Karen Reyes, who is in love with monsters. Her obsession is so consuming, it becomes an integral part of her identity. Her story, as shown in the graphic novel, is presented as pages from her wire-bound notebook, meaning it is through her eyes, not author Emil Ferriz's, that the story is told. And in the story, Karen has chosen to draw herself as a werewolf. Gloria Anzaldua's 1987 seminal work, Borderlands, La Frontera, The New Mestiza Consciousness, offers a framework to analyze Karen's relationship to monsters, the people around her, and herself. The borderland, as a concept, is both a physical and psychological space where two or more cultures, classes, or races come into contact. Quote, a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. The prohibited and forbidden are its inhabitants, the squint-eyed, the perverse, the queer, the troublesome, the mongrel, the mulatto, the half-breed, the half-dead. In short, those who cross over, pass over, or go through the confines of normal. The borderland envelops the biracial, queer, working-class 10-year-old Karen. However, its existence is hidden by the contrasting forces within it. In this presentation, I will examine the ways in which Karen resists the loss of her identity through assimilation into normal culture, instead constructing an oppositional binary of human versus monster. The binary is only disrupted when she comes into a new mestiza consciousness, which breaks down dualities that render her, quote, a prisoner, and show in the flesh and through the images in her work how duality is transcended. According to Ansel Dua, the mestiza storyteller is a shamanistic, supernatural shape changer who can take the form of an animal. It's appropriate then that Karen's story begins with illustrations of her transformation from a human girl into a werewolf. Her transition is painful, but as Karen takes on her new form, she howls out with joy. However, normal humans on the streets recognize the monstrosity and danger in the sound and move toward Karen's apartment with the intent to kill the freak. In Western civilization, monsters have typically been depicted as outside the boundaries of the community, marked as deviant and condemned to being ostracized and even hunted. Ansel Dua writes that those who were marked as deviant were believed to hold supernatural powers. These powers instilled fear in the community, but for the deviant, they were an extraordinary gift and a worthwhile exchange for the othering they experienced as a result. The vision of an angry mob, pitchforks in hand, startles Karen into waking up and realizing that the threat of the violent approaching crowd existed only in her nightmare. She slips into her mother's bed, seeking comfort. Karen's art shows that, even awake, her werewolf form lingers, implying that so too does the threat of the mob. Karen's biggest fear is not the mob, which she explains stands for mean, ordinary, and boring, that they will kill her, but that they will force her to assimilate into their culture, making her give up her extraordinary gift in favor of returning to the form of just another unremarkable human. The existential threat of the mob comes not just from the threat of assimilation, but from the refusal to recognize anything beyond the realities and perceptions that they've permitted. Even at school, Karen is bullied by her classmates, who look down on her and call her Mrs. Beasley. The distance put between Karen and her classmates grows so wide that Karen constructs a binary with humans and the mob on one end and she and monsters like her on the other. Karen is often isolated, but she finds companionship in fellow monsters her age, Sandy and Franklin. Sandy has a ghost-like appearance and a malnourished body. From clues given in Karen's narration, we come to suspect she's homeless. Franklin, a classmate, is a tall, soft-spoken Black boy with facial scarring who shares Karen's love of art. The mob has claimed every space that they, as kids, might inhabit, so they take shelter in places like art museums. The three recognize that kids' spaces are not welcoming to them. As Irving Goffman writes in Stigma, Notes on the Management of Spoiled Identity, the stigmatized individual has the same beliefs about identity as the larger normal culture. And as such, Karen and her friends measure themselves against those beliefs to discover that they are deviant. This then leads them, if only at moments, to internalize the stigma that others hold against them. For Karen, however, the taunts of her classmates is particularly hurtful and hard to brush off. Ansel Dua writes that the mestiza is, quote, subjected to a swamping of her psychological borders, and that she is, quote, plagued by psychic restlessness. Karen is tormented by her classmates' stigmatizing behavior, even as she herself embraces her position as a stigmatized individual. Rather than try and gain their acceptance, she turns toward her family. Karen takes comfort in her mother and older brother, DZ. And though she doesn't draw them as monsters, they too are considered other. Karen's mother is half Irish, half American Indian, and Karen's father was Mexican, three ethnic groups that have been historically marginalized. In the present, her family represents the coming together of various cultures, races, and ethnicities to embody a cracked mirror of America's treasured melting pot. Because of their marginalized identities, Karen and her family remain outside of the sphere of normal. Even so, Karen values the safe space her family has created in their basement apartment. In their company, rather than exclusively mourn her rejection by society, Karen is free to lean further into her monster persona. As stated earlier, Karen already lives in the borderland, but she is not ready to see it, despite her brother's gentle pushing. One day, as DZ and Karen walk uptown, he asks her what the people around them have in common. When Karen cannot answer, DZ chronicles the marginalization of various ethnic and racial groups throughout American history, connecting them all as victims of the Royal Shaft Express. Whether Spanish, Black, Indian, or hillbilly, these people are the present population of the borderland, united through exploitation. Karen, through her class, ethnicity, and race, is seemingly fated to join them. She even comes to learn that the mere fact that she is female is reason enough to put her in danger. While Karen internalizes explicit messages that she is abnormal and less than human, she also receives implicit messages telling her that being a woman puts her in an unsafe position. As Karen's tale is unfolding, she learns her mother has breast cancer. Not long after that, a group of older boys from her school, led by a boy named Jerry, attempt to sexually assault her. At the same time, Karen is trying to solve the murder of her upstairs neighbor, a woman who survived both child prostitution and the Holocaust. Karen takes solace in her monster magazines, but even their covers of scantily clad women being chased by monsters send subliminal messages that it is dangerous to be a person with breasts. Thus, Karen believes that human women are vulnerable to certain kinds of attacks, and by living as a monster, she not only avoids the danger of living as female, she embraces what Anzaldúa calls the inner shadow beast, allowing her to live her life the way she wants, without concern for how others might disapprove. However, while her monster persona obscures her gender and her race, it does nothing to conceal her attraction to girls. During a sleepover with her best friend, Missy, Karen confesses that she believes Missy is beautiful. In her sleep, Missy tells Karen that she loves her, and for Karen, the moment bristles with potential for the future. The next day, Missy asks her mother if two women can get married. Later the same day, Missy's mother calls Karen's to shame her for not protecting the kids from bad influences. After that, Missy is kept away from Karen and transformed from a fellow monster aficionado into a girly girl. Anzaldúa writes that society sends the message that people can either be male or female, and queer women of color disrupt this binary with their duality. Karen, who ascribes to her own binary of human versus monster, is pushed further beyond the limits of acceptance, while Missy is dragged into the mob. The stability of this binary depends on the retention of the border and the invisibility of the borderland itself. Only by othering, with no exception, can the mob maintain its normal identity. Yet it is the edging of culture against culture that makes visible the borderland. And as Missy and Karen find out, it is also, quote, where the space between two individuals shrinks with intimacy. After months spent apart, Missy and Karen are able to reunite by hiding in a stairwell together. Missy, in Karen's arms, confesses, quote, the times I'm with you are the only ones when I'm myself. Anzaldúa quotes Gershon Kaufman when she asserts that, quote, identity is the essential core of who we are as individuals, the conscious experience of the self inside. When they embrace, Karen and Missy become their most monstrous and truest forms in their own eyes and each other's. Karen and Missy define each other in a way that is similar in recognition, but opposite in intent from Karen and the mob. While Karen's relationship with the mob is one of mutual othering and antagonism, her relationship with Missy is one of love and mutual acceptance, in which they welcome each other's purest selves. Through scrutinizing her contrasting relationship to Missy and the mob, Karen begins to come into a new mestiza consciousness, which sees beyond the border into the borderland. The border is a construct of domination and control, but the borderland is a place of freedom, exploration, and knowledge. This knowledge forces a shifting in her positioning. Although Karen doesn't understand it yet, she recognizes herself as a resident of the borderland. According to Anzaldúa, this, quote, knowledge makes me more aware. It makes me more conscious. Knowing is painful, but after it happens, I can't stay in the same place and be comfortable. I am no longer the same person I was before. Karen and Missy look at each other and see one type of monster, and Karen and the mob look at each other and see a different type. Karen's acquisition of knowledge and change in positioning allows her to peel back the humanity of the mob and see the monstrosity underneath. This binary shifts from human and monster to bad monster and good monster. Karen writes, the bad monsters want the world to look the way they want it to. They need people to be afraid. They don't live in their lair and mostly mind their own biz. I guess that's the difference. A good monster sometimes gives somebody a fright because they're weird and fangy, a fact that is beyond their control. But bad monsters are all about control. They want the whole world to be scared so that bad monsters can call all the shots. In the end, Karen mistakenly replaces one binary with another. She believes she has reached the capital T truth, when in fact she has only opened the door to the borderland, which will in time lead to a transcendence that leaves binaries behind altogether. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Melissa. You can go ahead and turn your camera and mic off now. And we will go on over to Gabriel. Gabriel, please turn your camera and mic on, and you can share your screen if you would like. So Gabriel Guzmán Camacho is a PhD student in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at The Ohio State University. His paper is titled Periférica Boulevard, Complexity and Layers of Systematic Violence. Please take it away, Gabriel.
Okay, can you listen to me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, first of all, to everyone, and I'm very glad to be here. I'm sorry for if I'm missing some words. Originally, this paper is made it's in Spanish, so the translation probably is still working, right? I'm still working on the translation of many words and theoretical bodies that I'm working with. So I'm going to start with my presentation. So I'm going to talk about violence and systematic violence using a comic from Bolivia, the country where I'm from. So first of all, we have to understand that cultural products speaking about violence, systematic violence from Latin America, specifically from Latin America, have been going all around, right? But the lenses that the USA and Europe academics towards Latin American comic studies has been very specific in pointing out certain type of comics and certain type of countries producing comics, right? So in this sense, I've noticed that there's a little or zero attention on Bolivian comics, which I find kind of problematic in the sense that I understand Bolivia as a small country in the sense of representation, but at the same time, it doesn't reduce the possibilities of many discussions it can make throughout the academic world and in academic discussions, right? So in this work, I'm gonna specify two scenes on this comic, which is the relation of the police institution with a barman from the comic, and the relation of the police institution with the catacombs or catacumbas in La Paz, which is kind of like a city under the city, right? So my intention is to contribute to the inclusion of Bolivian comics in global systematic issues and discussions, to open them the potentiality to participate in these debates, and as well to open to articulate the relation of Spanish-speaking comics from Latin America, talking about the Latin American subject, not only here in the United States, but also in relation with Latin America as a geographical point. So from this sense of theoretically speaking, I also want to bring out Bolivian theoretical apparatus. Even though I use systematic violence from Slavoj Žižek, and I use the concept of abigarramiento, which means mottled, kind of mottled, from René Zabaleta Mercado, which is a Bolivian sociologist and thinker. So going on. To make a little context about the field I'm speaking of, Latin American comic studies have been recently, in the last decades, been increasing on the representation and debates in the United States academics and Europe academics. the usual themes they speak about are nationality, identity, memory, the comics itself, and representation. My point of view and my kind of contribution to this debate is that during all these themes that it's speaking about, there are gaps that are making Latin American comics being thrown apart, like relegated of like just a geographical point that it's not articulated with a more expanded and global issue, right? In this sense, making just a little more of a temporary kind of contribution in the field, we have I found that one of the first pioneers talking about Latin American comics was David William Foster with From a Falda to Los Supermachos in 1989, where he points out the popular characteristic of this cultural product, and this popular characteristic will make the intellectual group to understand Latin American background, right? So from this instance, we can understand that Latin American comics have been always seen from this lens of a popular product, right? So then it comes Héctor Fernández Lejost y Juan Poblete, which I want to point out that I'm jumping a little, some years to make sense of, there's a gap I'm still missing there. But well, Héctor Fernández Host and Juan Poblete, in 2009, they throw another project named Redrawing the National Identity Latino American Comics. So the product, the idea of this was to make sense of a product capable of connecting socio-economical and cultural modernizations in Latin America, right? But we have to point out that there was different kinds of modernization, right? I don't know if that was pointedly really worked out in this project. And then we have Jorge Catalá Carrasco, Paulo Drinot, and James Scorer, who wrote in 2016 Comics in Memory, an edition, where they try to articulate the idea of, well, it's not only a popular product that is trying to articulate the modernization of the culture, but it's also a historical process related with memory reconstruction. But it's focused on big countries in the sense of industrial, in the sense of comics production, like Condorito from Chile, Mafalda from Argentina, Monica from Brazil. So countries like Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, they're kind of reduced or even not mentioned in the comics representation, right? Then in 2017, Edward King and Joanna Page in Posthumanism and the Graphical Novel in Latin America, they kind of step backwards of this popular kind of idea of the cultural production. They talk about the globalization, posthumanism as representation of Latin America not being only popular, but it can also talk about other issues, global issues, even though they still don't mention the countries like Bolivia, Uruguay, Paraguay, and so on. Then we have in 2020 two projects that have been released: James Scorer Comics, Beyond the Page in Latin America, and Frederic Luis Aldama, Graphicide Indigeneity, Comics in the Americas and Australasia. In the first one, in James Scorer work, he is returning to the idea of, well, the popular characteristic is intrinsic in the inequality of Latin America. So the state and the cultural productions are always in tension on the comics field. But the complex of modernization, identity, and popular culture, it's always a lens that it's coming from United States and Europe towards Latin America in the moment to talk about Latin American comics. And well, then we have the last one from Frederic Luis Aldama, which talks about identity, representation, and more identity, right? So we have to think about the idea that Latin American comics are kind of reduced in the idea of representation, identity, and popular characteristic. So my contribution is to kind of talk and give this kind of authority into the Bolivian comics and say that, well, we can also talk about important issues and not being popular in the sense, in the academic sense, right? So then I'm going to talk about Periférica Boulevard. Well, Periférica Boulevard, it's very important because it's the first comic that has been released in an academic project, which is the Biblioteca Bicentenario de Bolivia, which is a big project of more than 2,000 books, of academic books, which talk about the history of Bolivia. So it's a very important comic in the history of being included in academic discussions, right? So there we go, breaking a little more this idea of the popular characteristic of Latin American comics. So the first one I want to start, the first scene, is the systematic violence that is projected and can be seen in this kind of discussions of this comic. We can understand by Slavoj Žižek that systematic violence comes from a triumvirate, or a triple kind of relation between subjective violence, objective violence, and systemic violence from an ideological and practical sense, right? So we understand that subjective violence is this visible violence, the one that we explicitly see, that you can also see in this page. But the systemic violence is what is behind what is visible, right? And this is a result of socioeconomic and cultural process, Slavoj Žižek points out that. So we have to understand that, like this page, the systematic and violence and subjective violence, they are interspersed, right? They are constantly talking to each other in the sense that they are overlaying one to another. If you can see the language that they're speaking on this page, for example, the policemen talking about the word like sambo, and the women singing about the caporales, which is a folklore dance that has been appropriated by white media class from Bolivia, right? They appropriated this dance. So the women is saying how the caporales is not available for her, and the caporales is actually a black culture from Bolivia, right? And now it's being appropriated by white medium class people. So the idea of the like the page shows, right, that the subjective violence and the systemic violence, they are constantly interspersing, right, one to another. So we can see that systematic violence, it kind of goes through the language, through the socio-economical class problem, and also through memory, right? Because talking about caporales, using the word sambo, those are words, colonial words. So they are talking of the same memory, of the same point of memory, but in different instances, right? In different moments. So going on ahead, to not giving so much time, I have another scene that I feel interesting to analyze and to understand how systematic violence is working. First of all, we have to understand, like Karl Marx in his Capital, he understands that commodity and money circulation needs a free worker in a double sense. He says that it needs a worker who is available to give this workforce. And in the second sense is that the worker doesn't have anything else to offer. So Karl Marx points out that this is not something that happens from nowhere. It's a imposed historical process that comes over time and over transformation. But these historical processes are not necessarily one, and it's not necessarily just one, right? They are overlaying historical, socioeconomical, and cultural process. Comes one after another, after another, after another, and they just put in one over the other. In this sense, René Zabaleta Mercado, which is this Bolivian sociologist, he appropriates this idea and he uses in his reflections, and he says, but what happens in mottled societies or sociedades abigarradas, which means abigarrado means kind of not one color, but kind of mixed colors and kind of a gray area in all of this complexity, layers of colors. So he says, what happens in mottled societies, which this mottled society are historical processes like Karl Marx says, that includes heterogeneity, but it's a disjointed heterogeneity. So René Zavaleta points out that in societies like Bolivia, we have a part of society with this, which is a capitalism society, and then we have another part of the society which still working on feudalism characteristics, but they are not working together. It's like we're having two types of society in just under one umbrella of state power, right? So he says that even though this model social formation must take care of different temporalities, systematic violence is capable of contract this temporality in a way that the structures can maintain their social consistence and power relation. And how you can see on the page that you can see on the left, it's very interesting because it's talking about the catacombas, right? I think I have here. Yeah. So in the left page, this is the social organization of the catacombas, you see. So the middle one, the middle part of the page, it shows that these catacombs of La Paz city, they have their own leader, right? This name is Rintintiner, right? He's the own leader of this place. But then the police institution came and they classified this as a terrorist, problematic part of the society, that it's relegated from society. And what happens is that the police institution comes and they try to pacify it, right? In the sense, in a military sense. So as you can see in the right page, in the top right corner of the right page, you can see like the catacombs is not a place of adults. It's actually a place of young people, young children, young women, young men who are living underground of the city in an inequality social characteristic of a capitalist social consequence. But in the right corner of the right page, you can see that these kids are coming out of this society, like erasing from this society, and the police is making them a line, which they are trying to put them to another, like you go to this house, you go to this another house, you're gonna be this place, you're gonna be. So the work of the police, instead of reinserting the kids into the society, they are actually disjointing or kind of breaking their own social organization to make.
Gabriel, you have 1 minute.
Okay, thank you. To make more inequality, right? So it's a reproduction of the same systematic violence once and once and once and once, in the sense of pacifying, right? So to end my conclusions, pointing out the zero representation of Bolivian comics, decolonize the popular stigmatization lenses for the possibility for a broad field of discussions and theoretical apparatus, point out the systematic violence institution in capitalist societies, and that we have to understand that violence doesn't occur from a point A to a point B, but it definitely involves a complex overlaying of historical systematic oppression and socio-historic transformations. So to reduce violence in the explicit fact is to banalize its profound roots. That would be it. Thank you very much.
Awesome, thanks so much. Gabriel, if you would stop sharing your screen and just keep your camera on, and then I'll ask the rest of our panelists to please turn your cameras and mics on now to join us for the Q&A portion. All right, is everybody here? Awesome, yeah, I can see all of you, excellent. Okay, so we've got about 6 minutes left for questions. Unfortunately, we've got a ton of questions, but we're on a very important live stream schedule here, so we got to keep going. So I want to ask a question that seems to be, I think, directed at the most, like the majority of you guys. So like most of you have a chance to talk, if not all. So first up, this is a question for Natalia, Preeti, and Melissa. Do you think the coastline paradox is helpful for thinking through the subjective nature of cartography or borders? And they say, a coastline is a fractal, so any measure of its length will vary based on the unit of measurement. So I think they're kind of asking this about like kind of the visual logics of the comics that you guys are talking about. So this is addressed for like 3 of you, but I think it could apply to a lot of you.
I can start.
Definitely, Natalia.
So I'm not super familiar with the coastline paradox, but I know it has to do with mathematical cartographic generalization. And I think it definitely does tie into sort of the subjective nature of mapping and especially of boundaries. Mapping being understood as very mathematical, very scientific and authoritative in a way, right? Historically, that's how it's been understood, as an object of authority. And I think that the coastline paradox sort of illustrates how the map only makes sense within its context, right? So if you measure it differently with different right measures of with sorts of measures, it gives you different things. And so and then with comics, we also always have to remember that these maps are mediated by the artist's hands. The artists are the ones that are drawing, that are materially creating these maps. And so definitely there's subjectivity there in terms of boundaries and borders.
Awesome, thanks so much. Preeti, would you like to go next? You're muted.
Yeah, no, I think Natalia answered what I pretty wanted to say.
Excellent. Would anybody else, Melissa or Gabriel,
Sure.
like to jump in on this?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with this, as Natalia said, but it reminds me of the observation effect in physics, where, you know, just observing a phenomenon changes it. And with the idea of the borderland and the borders, I think we have to think about the fact that who you are will position you differently. So in the case of My Favorite Thing is Monsters, who you are, your intersectionality, your positionality will re-inscribe the borders and re-inscribe what borderland you exist in. So I think you could definitely apply it.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for like maybe one more question, which is perfect because we have a question for Gabriel, so we'll get to hear from him too a little bit. So the question says that, I hear that issues of colorism are quite prevalent in Latin and South America. Does this get addressed alongside the question of systematic violence in Bolivian comics?
Thank you very much for the question. So I think trying to kind of understand very well where the question wants to go, but there's comics to talk about this issue, right? If that's kind of the question. But at the same time, we have to understand the idea of how this colorism affect in a country as Bolivia, right? Where we have a complex distribution of identities going through different kind of demographic and geographic point of view. So the idea of identity coming from the state, for example, is kind of incomplete because the state doesn't have the capability of reaching many zones of Bolivia, right? So the main idea of naming is a very colonialistic thing, right? So giving color also, it's a very colonialistic way in the sense that when it comes from the state, for example, right? So kind of going also, and I just want to mention something very interesting that I'm thinking about from the first question, just to close everything. I'm thinking about the maps during the colonization of and the invasion of Americas. For example, Oviedo, Cristobal Columbus, Americo Vespucci, they are very related with people who wrote maps, right? And the maps and the illustration of the maps were always a sense of naming and giving the other what the European lens wants to be, right? So the cartography and the mapping is also this, has also this historical background of colonizing the bodies and colonizing the idea of who is where and where they are, especially people in Latin America and the Americas.
Awesome. Thanks so much. We are perfectly on time. Thank you to all of our panelists for giving us their time today and sharing their awesome work. I'm going to ask all of you now to turn your cameras and mics off if they're on.